Hello everyone, I'm Dila Busquet, and today I'll be talking about context of Spanish inclusive language. Just to summarize super quickly from my prior presentation, Spanish is a gendered language, so we have to use masculine form for men, feminine form for women, and the generic masculine for groups of mixed gendered individuals, which gave way for inclusive language. So you can see in box 4 a few different endings, and then also we use doubling, so using the masculine and feminine form to talk about mixed gendered groups. As we discussed in class, inclusive language is very segregated spatially, so typically we find it in universities, social media, textbooks, and political speeches. So that kind of led to my study, which sought to answer what the function of inclusive language was in these settings and how it differed across formalities and spaces. So for my study, I went to a Spanish class here at Princeton and recorded the instructor. I also talked with this instructor outside of the class in kind of more informal Zoom chat about life. And then I also used some data from the Voces de Princeton linguistic corpus from this same instructor and compared the different uses of inclusive versus the generic masculine across spaces. So these were the questions that I asked in the informal Zoom chat. Some were more effective than others in eliciting kind of the generic masculine, but you can look over them right here. And so I then transcribed these interactions using MaxQDA to code moments of inclusive or generic masculine usage. The results are summarized in this slide with the most amount of inclusive language, 71%, found in my conversation with the participant about their usage of inclusive language at the end of the study, so kind of more meta-linguistic questions, followed by 35% in the Spanish language class, 20% in the informal Zoom chat, and 13% in the Voces de Princeton interview. And kind of those spaces in the percentage of inclusive language versus generic masculine, you can see summarized in this table. So we have the linguistic questions with the most, 70% here versus the least, the interview right there. I also had, with the meta-linguistic questions, a chance to kind of have some qualitative data in this study. So some things that kind of stood out to me in these questions was that inclusive language isn't just a thing, it's a stance or a positioning, and kind of how the participant thought about inclusive language in the different contexts. And you need to, think about where it makes sense to take this stance using inclusive language and how it's intentional and purposeful. I also thought it was very interesting how the participant mentioned that they use inclusive language at their house, in their home with their kids, which is something I didn't even think of and definitely will have to be a spot for future research for other participants and researchers to look into. And so the main conclusions that I took from all of this data was that the first comes from when one decides to use inclusive language. As seen in the qualitative data, inclusive language is seen not as something neutral, rather it's a stance or positioning. With taking a stance being tied to one's opinion and worldview, the context that one feels comfortable to take the stance matters. This doesn't necessarily indicate that more formal academic settings equal using inclusive language, rather it's who makes up these spaces that really matters. In terms of actual usage, it requires a conscious effort. This is observed in the dramatic increase of inclusive language that is used when talking about inclusive language. This was also observed in the actual classroom, which I'll show on the next slide, and how different classroom dynamics and distractions can increase and decrease inclusive language when you're thinking about it. And finally, with inclusive language just naturally being so tight in the classroom, I also observed an increase in inclusive language when talking about the people that inhabit these spaces that you can see on screen, such as, students, teachers, etc. So this is a graph of inclusive language in the generic masculine usage over time in the classroom setting. So we first see a big spike of the generic masculine, which is this green, versus inclusive language, which is this blue-green color here. So this is the professor basically explaining why I'm at this class and why I'm recording them instead of I'm not recording the students. So that is just that explanation right there. And this is kind of off script, I would say, for the class. This is not something that normally goes on, so that's a big increase. There's also a big increase here when talking about a group of people. So this was them discussing a reading, and we see a big jump as well with the inclusive language, which, if you're using doubling, which is kind of, I would say, the biggest strategy when speaking, using inclusive language that speakers will use, so saying the feminine, the masculine, eventually that gets very repetitive, so that's when you start to see the generic masculine also spike. And then as the class starts running out of time and the professor is rushing to get through all of the grammar before their quiz the next class, that's when we see more generic masculine popping up. So confounds, it's really hard to facilitate an informal conversation with your past Spanish professor on Zoom. This professor knows that I study inclusive language outside of this class, so that's also another potential influence. The duration of the recordings could have been longer. It would have been nice to have longer informal chats to kind of get more data. And then when I went to this class, they were doing grammar, which is not the best for kind of getting natural speech. You're getting a very, this is what's right, this is what's wrong kind of situation with kind of pre-planned language versus something more spontaneous. And then I only went to one class because it was the end of the semester. But going to more classes, talking to more people, all of that important stuff. So that brings to future research. Obviously, we should get more participants besides just one person that I studied this time. A longitudinal study would be helpful, so studying this over time. And then I think the home setting is a really key element to this because the participant mentioned that they use it at home, so it kind of really is the most informal setting you can get. And figuring out how inclusive language can work in these settings when you're definitely not thinking about it then, very interesting. And then finally, the different types of groups. So at what point does inclusive language, start to creep into people's minds based on the makeup of groups, how many people, the different genders, etc. So that is all I have. Thank you very much.